I discovered that my own parents had used my identity to run up a monstrous debt. There are certain things you imagine happening to other people, stories that you read on news websites, feel sorry for 2 minutes, and then go back to having breakfast. I was one of those people until the day I opened the letter from the bank. It was a random morning, cloudy skies, hellish traffic, life as usual. I picked up the mail from the building and went upstairs to my cramped apartment, balancing my cell phone on my shoulder as I discussed work deadlines with my boss. I didn't pay any attention to the letters at first. I threw everything on the worktop, and only in the evening, when the world finally fell silent, did I go through the pile. One of them caught my eye. The envelope was official, heavy, marked with those threatening letters that banks love to use when they want to make someone tremble. I opened it with the tip of my key without hurrying, thinking it might be an old statement, perhaps an error. It wasn't. The letter said, with all the fine words that lawyers know how to choose, that there was a collection suit against me for defaulting on a $300,000 loan. I'd been given a tight deadline to pay up before they took more severe legal action. I sat down on the kitchen floor, not because I wanted to dramatize it. My body just gave out. I didn't understand. It didn't make sense. I hadn't taken out any loans. I could barely keep a positive balance at the end of the month. Credit card? Very low limit. Clean name, or at least I thought I was. For almost an hour, I stood there, staring at the paper as if it would change its meaning if I looked at it long enough. When I finally managed to move, I called the number listed on the letter. On the other end of the line, a bored woman confirmed the details. My full name, my social security number, my current address, all correct, all official. There was no point in saying I didn't recognize the debt. To the system, I was just another person trying to avoid their obligations. I hung up the phone, not knowing what to do. I paced back and forth, feeling my heart beating out of rhythm, as if it were trying to warn me that this was only the beginning. The first suspicions began to creep in. Who would have access to my documents? Who would know such specific details? Friends? No. Work colleagues? Unlikely. My documents were always with me, tucked away in an old drawer that hardly anyone saw. Family. The word hit my head with an uncomfortable force. At first, I rejected the idea. It was absurd. My parents could be complicated, demanding, even cruel at times with their words, but this was another level. It was a crime. It was betrayal. It was tearing away the last shred of trust that remained. Even so, the doubt remained, planted like a bitter seed. The next day, I took the morning off and went to the bank. Maybe I could sort it out in person. Perhaps it was all a grotesque mistake, a case of homonyms, an unfortunate coincidence. I wanted to believe that with all my might. The clerk looked at me with pity as soon as I opened my mouth. She explained in the mechanical voice of someone who has already memorized that speech that the loan had been taken out 2 years ago. They presented valid documents, corresponding signatures, receipts in my name, everything registered, digitized, archived. I asked to see it. She hesitated, but after a few minutes she brought out a folder. There were copies of my personal documents, my signature, even an income statement, made up, of course, with amounts I had never seen in the account. I leafed through each page with trembling fingers. When I saw the signature on the main contract, the world seemed to spin. It was my handwriting, all right, or a perfect imitation. I felt a lump rise in my throat, a bitter taste invading my mouth. It was as if I had been symbolically murdered there on the cold counter of that bank. I left aimlessly. I walked through the city without seeing the streets, without hearing the cars. All I could think about was how it had happened without me noticing. At what point did I leave gaps? When did I let my guard down? By the end of the day, only one thing was clear in my head. I needed to talk to my parents. Not a protocol conversation, like so many we'd had over the years. I needed answers. I needed the truth, no matter who it hurt. I took the first bus to their house. I didn't call ahead. I didn't tell them. I wanted to see the raw reaction with no time to make up stories. The journey seemed endless. Every kilometer was like going through layers of illusion that I had built up to protect my childhood, my emotional memory, my desperate need to have roots somewhere. When I arrived, the porch light was on. There was a smell of food burning in the air. My father sat in his armchair, reading the newspaper as usual. My mother in the kitchen, unwillingly moving pans around. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, and yet everything was wrong. I entered without knocking. My mother looked at me with an expression mixed with surprise and irritation. My father didn't even look up from his newspaper. I sat down at the table, pulled the letter from the bank out of my bag, and placed it in the center. I waited. My mother wiped her hands on her apron. She came closer, read the first line, and froze. My father finally looked up but said nothing. The atmosphere changed, as if the air had become heavier. It was my mother who broke the silence. "You don't understand. We had to. It was for the good of the family." The words sounded hollow, artificial, like phrases rehearsed to justify the unjustifiable. I asked for explanations. I asked for anything that could make it less grotesque. It was then that my father spoke, with the dry voice of someone who doesn't feel the slightest shame. "If it hadn't been for us, you wouldn't have been born. You owe it to us." I stared at them, trying to process what I had just heard. In their minds, the debt was fair. In their minds, my birth was an eternal debt that was now being collected with interest and without warning. I got up from my chair without being able to articulate a word. My legs were shaking, but I managed to get to the door. Before I left, I heard my mother say, almost in a whisper, as if that would ease the pain, "It was just money. You're healthy. You should be grateful." I crossed the street without looking back. I knew that nothing would be the same after that night, and deep down, I knew that the worst was yet to come. I don't remember exactly how I got home that night. My feet walked alone, guided by an impulse that no longer came from reason. The lights of the city blurred around me as if the whole world had lost focus. I entered the apartment, locked the door, dropped my bag on the floor, and sat down in the first chair I found. I stood there staring into the void, as if time had frozen. My head was throbbing, but it was a dull pain, like a deep cut that hasn't really started to bleed yet. I tried to organize my thoughts, to put a name to what I was feeling, but I couldn't find any words to fit the sensation. It was a mixture of disbelief, anger, and a sadness so dense that it seemed to occupy the physical space of the room. For days, I lived like a ghost. I went to work, answered emails, smiled mechanically at people, but everything seemed to happen miles away from me. At night, I would toss and turn in bed, reliving every sentence said in that kitchen. The words echoed like gunshots in the dark. "You owe us. If it hadn't been for us, you wouldn't even have been born. It was just money." I tried to understand at what point in my life that line was crossed, at what point the idea of family dissolved without my realizing it. I couldn't find any answers, just more questions that multiplied like plagues. The letter from the bank was still there, on the table, as a permanent reminder of the betrayal. I avoided touching it, but I couldn't throw it away. It was the only concrete proof that it was real, that I wasn't going mad. I looked for a lawyer. I didn't have any money to spare, but something had to be done. I explained the case dryly, without going into personal details. Across the table, he looked at me with the same expression as someone who sees a crashed car on the road, pity mixed with professionalism. He said that it was possible to contest the debt, but that the process would be long, expensive, and emotionally exhausting. That, in practice, it would be an unequal fight, where I would have to prove that my own parents had committed fraud against me, that, depending on the evidence and their stance, the case could turn into a formal prosecution, perhaps even imprisonment. I listened in silence. Part of me wanted to go ahead, Sue, shout to the whole world what they had done. Another part, smaller and more tired, just wanted to disappear, to start a new life somewhere else, where no one would know who I was. I returned home with my head boiling. I spent hours walking from room to room, moving objects for no reason, trying to find some magical solution that would solve everything without destroying myself in the process. I couldn't. That night, I wrote them a letter. Not a request, not a plea. A cold, objective letter demanding that they pay the debt, that they take responsibility. I gave them a short deadline, enclosed a copy of the documents, and made it clear that if they didn't, I would take the necessary measures. I sent it by email and also by post, so they wouldn't make excuses. The reply came 2 days later in the form of a short message from my mother. "Are you really going to do this to us, after all we've done for you?" I read the sentence dozens of times, trying to find any shadow of regret. There wasn't, just accusation, just the old blame game I'd known since I was a child, but which had now taken on monstrous proportions. It was clear that they would assume nothing, that for them I was the ungrateful one, the traitor, the daughter who dared to demand what should have been accepted in silence. I made my decision. I started the legal process. I filled in forms, signed papers, told the story to strangers who looked at me with wide eyes, as if they couldn't believe that parents were capable of this. Every word I wrote was like a stab, not because I still loved them, that bond had already been torn, but because the part of me that still wanted to belong to something died a little more with each signature. Time became an enemy. Each week of waiting was a silent torture. I didn't know if they would try to fight back, if they would make a scandal, if they would try to destroy me publicly. I slept little with bad dreams that mixed dark courts, judgmental looks, and screams that woke me up before dawn. My closest friends found out little by little. The reaction was almost always the same: shock, pity, then an uncomfortable silence. No one knew exactly what to say. Some friendships weakened, unable to bear the heavy load I was now carrying. Others strengthened in unexpected ways. I began to close myself off even more. I avoided social media. I avoided places where I could meet acquaintances. I felt ashamed, even though I knew it wasn't my fault. It was like carrying a scar on my forehead, a visible reminder that I had failed at the most basic game in life, trusting the right people. The process progressed slowly, like everything that depends on justice. But the bank didn't wait. They bombarded me with charges, threats, and notices. My accounts began to be blocked. My cards were canceled. I had to ask for help to pay the rent, to buy food. I went from a simple but dignified life to the brink of bankruptcy in a matter of weeks. And all because of those who should have protected me. It wasn't just the money. It was what it represented, the theft of my identity, my freedom, my dignity. One night, unable to sleep, I sat on the balcony of the apartment with a cheap bottle of wine and watched the city lights flicker below. I thought about everything I had lost: the confidence, the firm ground I believed I had under my feet, the stupid innocence that thought blood was synonymous with love. The bottle emptied, and I continued to stand there, feeling the cold wind cut across my face, trying to understand how someone could look at their own son and see only a financial opportunity. I couldn't find an answer. I only understood that from then on, I would have to dig my own path, without expecting rescue, without relying on those who had already shown me who they really were. What I didn't know was that the lowest blow was yet to come. The following months became a succession of small blows that, taken together, seemed to want to annihilate me from the inside out. Each morning began with bank notices, threatening letters, cold collections written by automated systems that didn't know and didn't care about the difference between an ordinary debtor and a victim of fraud. The days were the same, faded, a repetition of failed attempts to resolve what seemed to multiply every time I thought I'd taken a step forward. My lawyer, although committed, was honest about the chances. He said that even if I proved the misuse of my identity, the bank could insist, and that the damage would be brutal. Family lawsuits, he warned, rarely end cleanly. I began to feel what I had only read about in newspaper articles. Companies that had previously offered me credit now treated me like a walking risk. My name spread through databases like an invisible virus. I resigned from the job I could barely keep, ashamed that I had become a shadow of my former self. I found temporary work, low-paid freelance jobs, anything that would allow me to put food on the table while I tried to keep my head above water. At the time, I almost lost my apartment. The only reason it didn't happen was because a childhood friend, upon learning of the situation, lent me money with no questions asked. I cried alone that night, not just for the unexpected help, but for the reminder that there were people who still saw something in me besides shame and debt. While I struggled not to sink, my parents carried on with their lives as if nothing had happened. Social networks showed photos of trips, Sunday barbecues, laughter at parties I would never be invited to again. It was like watching a horror movie where the monsters don't hide in the shadows, but smile at the camera. From time to time, I tried to follow the progress of the case. Each call to the lawyer was an exercise in patience and endurance. There was rarely any news. The wheels of justice were slow, chewing up my energy in small daily chunks. It was during one of those dark days that I received the call that changed everything. An official from the local registry office called me to say that she needed to confirm some details in order to register a new mortgage in my name. I didn't understand immediately. I asked her to repeat it. The woman, with the impersonal calm of someone who deals with papers and not lives, explained that a recent application had been opened for a new loan of considerable value using my information. The ground seemed to disappear beneath my feet. I asked for details. She hesitated, but eventually I managed to get some basic information: names involved, address, amount. My blood ran cold when I realized that the documentation used was the same as that attached to the current lawsuit. Documents that could only have been accessed by two people other than me, my lawyer and my parents. Trembling, I hung up the phone. My head was spinning with anger and disbelief. They hadn't just stolen my identity once. They were trying again, even now, even after everything, even knowing that I was struggling to survive the consequences of the first betrayal. That night, for the first time, I seriously considered disappearing. Not in a dramatic gesture, just disappearing, change my name, starting over in another state, another country if necessary, leaving behind not only the debt, but the memory of who I had been, the person who believed that family love was unconditional. I spent hours researching possibilities. I watched videos of people who had done it, stories of forced rebirths. Some worked, others ended up in even darker alleys. Even so, for a few hours, the thought brought me a dangerous peace. The next day, I made a different decision. I wasn't going to run away. I wasn't going to make life easier for those who tried to erase me. I went to the registry office in person. I asked to see the documents used in the new fraud attempt. I faced suspicious looks, bureaucratic protocols, and invasive questions. In the end, after much insistence, they put the paperwork in my hands. I leafed through each page with the calm of someone reading the sentence of their own past. There they were, my parents as legal representatives, presenting an absurd narrative in which I was incapable of managing my own assets and therefore needed financial guardianship, a grotesque attempt to justify using my name to get into further debt. I immediately signed a formal request to block the case. When I left the registry office, the sky was gray, heavy, as if the whole world was about to collapse on me. This time, I didn't cry. The pain had turned into something colder, more solid, a rock inside my chest that kept me standing even when everything around me seemed to be collapsing. I went back to my lawyer. I told him everything. I showed him the new documents. His normally imperturbable expression changed. For the first time, I saw anger in his eyes. I told him that this was a game changer, that we could now ask for precautionary measures, that there was proof of continued bad faith. The lawsuits gained momentum. My parents, realizing that the situation was getting out of hand, started looking for me. Phone calls, messages from relatives, pathetic attempts to appeal to guilt, to the memory of happy Christmases, to Sunday lunches that now seemed like made-up scenes. I didn't answer. Each ignored call was a small victory, a piece of the puzzle of my liberation being fitted together. During that time, a lot changed inside me. I stopped looking for approval. I stopped trying to understand how or why they had done it. I accepted that some questions don't have answers that ease the pain. And above all, I accepted that the absence of love where there should be love is a wound that never fully heals. But even so, we learned to live with it. The story wasn't over yet. There would still be hearings, papers to sign, bureaucracy to deal with. But for the first time in a long time, I felt that the ground beneath my feet was firm, that, although I was still full of scars, I was moving forward. Once the processes started moving, their reality finally began to really crack. I didn't see it myself. I didn't need to. The information came from around the corner, slipped through social networks, came in the form of cross comments from relatives who had barely spoken to me before, but who now seemed concerned about preserving the family's good name. The parties disappeared from their profiles. The trip stopped. The plastic smile they used to show the world turned into silence. Meanwhile, my life continued in a mixture of reconstruction and caution. Every step was measured, every expense controlled, every word thought about 1,000 times before it was spoken. Living with the bare minimum, I carried something in me that no amount of money could buy. The awareness that even in the face of the desert that had become my past, I was still breathing of my own accord. The first hearing came on a rainy day, one of those days when the sky seems to weigh down the whole city. I arrived early, holding a thin folder with all the documents that could prove what they had done. I waited alone in the cold corridor of the courthouse, watching the hands of the clock tick away as if they were mocking my anxiety. When they arrived, I saw them from a distance. My mother dressed like someone going to a wake, my father with the same impenetrable expression he used to wear when dealing with any problem, pretending it wasn't his business. Our gazes met briefly. There was no anger, no shame, just an icy indifference that went through me like a knife. During the hearing, his lawyers tried everything. They claimed misunderstandings, miscommunications, documents signed without full awareness. It was pathetic theater staged in front of a judge who, despite his neutral stance, seemed to have no patience for such poorly constructed excuses. I said little. I let the papers speak for me. I let the statements, the call logs, the forgotten emails tell the story that my words no longer had the strength to support. When I left that room, I didn't feel victory, I felt tiredness. Winning a battle like this doesn't bring the satisfaction people imagine. It's not like in the movies. There's no applause, no background music. There's only the weight of what has been lost and the certainty that certain wounds, once opened, never really close. The preliminary decision was in my favor. The judge ordered the blocking of their assets, the annulment of the new financing, and made room for a settlement, which, according to my lawyer, would be quicker and less traumatic than taking everything to the end. It took me days to accept the idea of a settlement. Part of me wanted to see them collapse completely, lose everything, prove to the world who they really were. Another part, exhausted to the bone, just wanted to close that chapter, sweep up the pieces, and move on. In the end, I chose my peace. I accepted the agreement with strict conditions: payment of the full debt, compensation for the financial damage I had suffered, and a clause preventing any future attempt to use my name for any purpose. They signed it. They did so without looking me in the eye, as if I were just another bureaucratic obstacle in their way. There was no apology, no gesture of regret, just pens sliding across papers and the dry sound of stamps sealing what was left of our history. When I left the registry office with the paperwork in hand, it felt strange. It wasn't relief. It wasn't happiness. It was a kind of silent emptiness, as if the war had consumed every last spark of something that was once alive inside me. Over the next few months, I began to sew together a new life. I changed my number, my address, my routine. I avoided the places we used to go. I avoided anyone who might strike up conversations about how things ended. I accepted that some stories don't need to be retold, that some pains don't need to be justified. I got a new job, nothing great, but honest. A small law firm that needed someone to take care of the administration. There, no one knew what I had experienced. I could just be me, without the shadow of shame, without the need to explain the invisible scars. Over time, I stopped waiting to hear from them. Little by little, my curiosity died. I stopped stalking social networks and asking acquaintances. I let the past stay where it always should have been, behind me. There were nights when I woke up in a cold sweat, confused dreams in which documents came to life and chased me, in which familiar faces appeared, accusing, demanding, charging. But it passed, like a hangover from something you don't remember drinking, but know you'll carry in your gut for a long time. On one of those quiet days, sorting through old boxes, I found a childhood photograph. We were all smiling, me, small, and wearing a yellow dress among my parents, who seemed so different from what they had become. I looked at that picture for long minutes. I didn't cry. The girl in the photo no longer existed, and that was okay. She had been sacrificed for the price of a debt that should never have been hers. But the woman who remained was stronger than any of them had ever imagined. Burning the photograph in the kitchen sink, I watched the paper slowly burn to ashes. It wasn't a ritual of hatred, it was liberation. What they did marked my history, but it wouldn't define my future. Life after the war was strangely silent. No apologies, no attempts at reconciliation, no dramatic scenes of belated regret. It was as if I had died for them, and in a way, maybe I had. There were no more family birthdays, no more automatic messages on commemorative dates. The memories, once heavy, began to seem like dusty records of a life that no longer belonged to me. Over time, the weight on my back lessened, not because things magically worked out, but because resignation took the place of hope. I understood that some relationships end even without explicit fights. They fall apart in silence, in disregard, in the inability to recognize the other person as someone worthy of respect. The money I recovered, although enough to erase the most urgent debts, couldn't erase the scars left behind. It didn't solve the sleepless nights or the panic attacks that sometimes took me by surprise in the supermarket, in the queue at the bank, or in the middle of a banal conversation. It took me a long time to understand that the real cure wouldn't come from the courts or bank balances. It would have to come from a much deeper and more solitary place. So I decided to do something I'd always put off. I took a bus to a small coastal town a few hours from where I lived. I didn't tell anyone. I took only a small backpack and the desire to breathe away from everything that still reminded me of what had happened. When I got there, I rented a simple room in a rundown hostel where the walls smelled of the sea and the beds creaked with every movement. The woman who welcomed me spoke very few words, which was a relief. I spent days walking along the sand, with the cold wind cutting across my face and the sound of the waves drowning out the thoughts that kept coming back. During those walks, I mentally revisited everything I had experienced, the cruel phrases, the empty looks, the broken promises. I also relived the moments when I found myself alone in the world, sinking without anyone holding out a hand, not to nurse my sorrows, but to accept that it had happened and that, like it or not, it was part of my story. It was in this forgotten city that I realized there was still life in me, even after everything. One cloudy morning, I sat in a tiny cafe and began to write, not letters to those who betrayed me, nor diaries full of regrets, just loose words, pieces of thoughts that needed to come out of me, without purpose, without censorship, as if I were pouring out a poison that had been stored away for too long. The pages piled up, they weren't beautiful or poetic. They were raw, hard, true, and somehow they rebuilt me from the inside out. I understood that I would never have the margarine commercial family that so many are proud to show off on social media. I understood that love isn't guaranteed by DNA, and that loyalty isn't born by chance. I understood that being betrayed by those who should protect you is a pain that shapes the rest of your life, but it doesn't have to be the only story you carry. I came home with less weight, not because I had forgotten, but because I had accepted that I deserved a new life, free from the invisible chains that had tried to bind me. I really started again. I changed my profession, my social circle, even the little habits that reminded me of who I was before everything collapsed. I created a new routine where every achievement, no matter how small, was celebrated as a personal victory. I never looked for them again, not out of hatred or pride, simply because I understood that moving on requires the courage to let go not only of what has hurt us, but also of what we insist on carrying, even after we know it can no longer be repaired. Birthdays became mine alone, celebrated the way I wanted, without waiting for anyone's approval or applause. Important dates stopped being reminders of what I'd lost and became milestones of what I'd survived. Somewhere along this silent path, I realized that I had stopped being a victim, not because the pain had disappeared, but because I had learned to walk even when it was cramping my steps. I no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. I didn't owe my existence to anyone. Today, if I bumped into them in the street, I might not feel a thing. Maybe just a slight discomfort, like when you see an old building crumbling in the distance, part of the landscape, but without the power to reach any further. The love I once begged for is no longer needed. Their lack of regret no longer hurts me. The sense of injustice that once consumed me has become a distant echo. What remained was something else. What remained was the certainty that I can remake myself as many times as necessary, that no one can steal my story even if they tried, that my identity, despite forged documents and attempts to erase it, is mine and no one else's. I may not have the family I dreamed of. I may not have the family I dreamed of, but I have myself, and in the end, that's all I needed to start again. And if you were in my shoes, would you have done anything differently? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to leave a like,